There is a topic that many people find quite challenging to talk about, kind of regardless of trauma history. But survivors of childhood sexual trauma in particular have a lot of difficulty talking about this. And it really is an important thing to be able to talk through and process and heal. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. So, can you guess what this topic might be? Sex. Our own sexuality, having sex, being sexual, just all kinds of things tied to sex. And I'm hoping that talking about this does not affect my channel at all. But I have done a video previously talking about some specific things around sex, so hopefully it does not. But just even notice what's coming up for you. Do you notice any sort of reaction in your body? Any thoughts, any maybe even feelings of shame starting to arise? If so, that's such a perfect example of how and why this is such a challenging conversation to have. But even if none of those things are present, along this healing journey, there are many factors around sex and sexuality that influence both the impact and the healing. So this is a huge topic, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this video, and I don't want it to be too long. But there's a couple of things in particular that I want to talk about. And the first is that we tend to carry so much shame around our own sexuality. And depending on how we responded to abuse and how we tend to cope, we can also have a whole lot of shame around becoming sexual, particularly maybe at a young age. And so, or really there could be shame around becoming non-sexual or asexual as well. Now, I want to be clear that none of what I'm really talking about today is going to be specific or having to do a whole lot with sexuality in terms of being gay or straight or any of that kind of stuff. We could have a whole other conversation around sexual abuse and different things associated with that. I want to be clear before I move on, being sexually abused does not change your sexuality in terms of gay, straight, whatever. So shame is such a significant piece of one of the ways that we're impacted with being a survivor of sexual trauma. Now, you've probably heard me talk about how shame is something that all of us, particularly as trauma survivors, childhood trauma survivors, experience, and that shame can cover many areas. But when it comes to sex or sexuality, the shame is so deep in part because of the nature of how that shame developed. Excuse me, in terms of things that were done that make us think and feel and believe things about physical touch, about sex, about pain and pleasure. So it's such a complicated and complex thing to sort through. So I feel like I can pretty confidently say that anybody who's experienced childhood sexual abuse likely has a lot of shame around sex, their body, their genitals, pleasure, sexual pleasure in particular, sexual interest, all kinds of things. Now, it may not present itself as thoughts like, oh, I'm so ashamed of this. Shame can present itself in lots of different ways. But I really do believe that I can confidently say that anybody who experienced childhood sexual abuse is likely going to carry some shame. Now, the caveat to that could be, if when you were sexually abused and you were able to tell and you were believed and you got the healing that you needed at that particular time, my guess is you're still probably going to have some shame, though it may not be quite as deep as it might be for people that didn't tell and didn't get support, weren't believed, those kinds of things. So the way that shame impacts us, and the shame begins, generally speaking, from the very first moment that something happens. And it doesn't have to be physical, because much of the grooming process can be little comments or little subtle types of touches, jokes or teasing that might have a little bit of like a sexual type of undertone. So it might not be obvious, but you may recall some specific things that stand out to you, that somebody said something to you and it just didn't feel good. Like it felt uncomfortable, uneasy, maybe icky. So it doesn't have to be being physically touched in some way or sexually touched in some way. It could be the way somebody's looked at you and they just kind of follow you around or make little comments. And the comments don't have to be specifically sexual. They could be like even something that a lot of parents used to do. I don't know that it's happening as much now, but like, you're going to make some man really happy someday, or make some girl really happy someday, or something like that, because of maybe how you look or how your body is developing. So that shame, again, influences everything about how we view ourselves generally, but specifically how we view our bodies, how we view our sexuality, how we view our role in the world. That's a huge thing. So oftentimes people wonder, with having been sexually abused, is it possible to have a healthy sex life? Is it possible to get to a place where I feel healthy about my sexuality, or can I feel connected to my body and not hate it for reacting in the way that it did, or any number of things? Those are just a few of many examples. So can you reconnect to your body? Can you feel good about your body? The simple answer is yes. Now, there's a lot that goes into getting to that place. So there's nothing simple about the process of getting there. But can you get there? Yes, with healing. And sometimes it takes specific work to get there, depending on how deep it is or how much of a struggle it is, depending on lots of things about your particular experiences. It may happen somewhat organically, just kind of by the healing process generally. So, for example, with my work with people, and even kind of in my own personal experience, we don't have to talk specifically about, okay, there's a lot of shame connected to your sexual abuse. Let's work on healing that shame so that you can feel connected in your body and enjoy sex. We don't have to talk about that specifically. Not that we don't, and not that we can't, and not even that it might not be helpful at times. But oftentimes, just by everything else that we're doing, the healing that is happening, some of those things begin to kind of organically unfold. And I think that that's true for healing generally. And I've talked about that before, but so that can happen. The simple answer is yes, but it is definitely a process to get there. There's a lot of healing that needs to happen to get there. Can you get to a place where you don't have shame? Yes. Whether it's about your body, what happened, whatever. Can you get there? Again, the simple answer is yes, you can. That takes a lot of healing. And when it comes to shame, there are some things potentially that you may have to talk very specifically about. So I have talked about this before, but when it comes to healing and releasing shame, you don't necessarily have to talk about everything that you feel shame around. Because again, as you start building and cultivating that sense of self-compassion, as you start understanding yourself more, some of the shame that you've carried around, some of the specific pieces maybe, that will begin to naturally heal. If there are things, and I will say most often the things where this tends to be the case, if there are things that you experienced as a result of the sexual abuse that you hold on to, and it's something that you very easily, your mind easily goes back to whenever you're feeling bad about yourself or shame comes up, that there's a very strong connection between something that you experienced, you might view it as something that you did, something that your body did, something that happened, something that somebody said to you. If there is shame tied to some very specific things that continue to come up over and over again, it likely is going to be important for you to talk about the shame that you feel around it. So you've probably heard me say before that when it comes to healing from childhood sexual trauma, we don't have to talk about all the details. We really don't. Obviously, being able to talk about the reality that it happened and maybe some specific things, but when it comes to healing from shame, when there are things that continue to come up, that they're the things that you go to as evidence, and I'm putting that in quotes because you know what I'm talking about, right? If you've been on this journey, if you've experienced this, you know that there are certain things, maybe in some specific situations, that your mind automatically goes back to as the evidence as to why you should feel that shame. And of course, that isn't true, but those are the types of things that often can be important, maybe even necessary to talk about on this healing journey. Because shame breeds in secrecy. And so until you're able to speak about it, and oftentimes this kind of stuff, if there's a lot of deep shame around it, I think generally speaking, I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to do that with a friend or a non-professional, I guess I will say, because people, even well-meaning, can respond in ways that can reinforce the shame. And not to say that a therapist can't do the same, because they certainly can. But again, hopefully you're working with somebody that has a lot of experience in working with childhood trauma, sexual trauma survivors. So hopefully that would not be the case. And if it is, please consider seeing somebody else. So there may be some specific things that you need to explore so that you can release that shame. There's also, I think, one of the really important pieces of being able to heal that aspect of your life is a process of being able to kind of reconnect with your body, your desires, your needs, generally speaking, but being able to kind of step back from all of your sexual experiences, all your like dating relationships or any of that kind of stuff. Take a step back and see if you can take some time, and it does take time, to just think about, what do I want? What do I want it to look like? What do I want it to feel like? Because when you are sexually abused as a child, you are taught, quite literally taught, that what you want doesn't matter. What you don't want doesn't matter. How you feel does not matter. Pleasure and pain do not matter, right? You're taught that. You may have been told it specifically, but nobody has to say anything about any of that in order for you to be taught that. And it is a very deep lesson, very unconscious lesson that is learned and that we carry with us. So part of this process is being able to take a step back from that and all the things that you've thought that you wanted or needed, and maybe those stay with you. But there's a good chance that there are things that you think that you should want or should feel or should do or shouldn't for any of those. And so you believe that that's just the way that it is, or, oh, that is really what I want. So giving yourself some space is important. And one of the ways that sometimes can be helpful, doesn't have to be this way, is to refrain from any sort of physical, sexual types of experiences, even with yourself, for a little while. So kind of just backing off from any sort of sexual activity. Because when you continue to engage in it, it can skew things a little bit. So that's one possibility. The length of time, it's going to vary for everybody. But like I said, it doesn't have to be that way. There are other things that you can do. Particularly if you are in a relationship with somebody and you feel like it's a supportive relationship. And I would say if this is a monogamous type of relationship, so not if you're sleeping with different people, engaging sexually with different people, and whether the other partner knows or whether the partner knows about it or not really doesn't even matter. But if you are in a monogamous relationship with somebody who is supportive of you and knows some of your history, then there are some things that you can do within the context of that relationship that can be really helpful. And I don't want to get into a whole lot of that here because there's a lot of nuance to it, and that could be a whole separate video. But ultimately, a lot of that is about giving yourself the space, like energetically, like even thinking about that as an energetic sort of space to not feel like you have to do something or you should do something, whether for somebody else or for yourself. There's actually a book, and the name is, it's been around for a long time. I can't think of the name of it right now, but I will find it and leave the name of the book in the description below. But the author is Wendy Maltz. I remember that. And I've recommended this book many times over the years. Sexual Healing Journey maybe is the title. Anyway, I think it's a really great book. There are some things that I don't necessarily completely agree with, and honestly, it's been so long since I've read it that I don't remember exactly what those things are. But there are some things that aren't necessarily things that I would suggest or agree with. But I do think that there are some good pieces in there. And one of the things that she does talk about is, I don't know how she references it, but basically like kind of taking a break. And even exploring masturbation is part of the process of discovering what you want and how you feel and what feels good and what doesn't and that sort of thing. So that exploring something like that can be helpful as well. Another thing that people will sometimes feel some shame around is the fact that they can enjoy sex, even if they haven't done any healing or much healing. And when I say enjoy it, that might mean orgasm, but it doesn't have to mean that, right? There are lots of ways that we can enjoy sex. But oftentimes people will have a lot of shame around that because they think, well, if this happened to me, I should hate sex. I should be afraid of sex. And of course, that can happen. But from my experience, personal and professional, while there might be some fear on some level about sex, and maybe it's not so much enjoying it from a place of freedom, but from my experience, more people tend to go in the direction of having sex pretty early, having a lot of sex, maybe even having sex with a lot of different people. There's a lot that can happen there. And that's, of course, not always going to be the case. People tend to go in one of two directions, either not engaging at all, at least not by choice, or kind of going the other direction and engaging a lot. And the people that go into that direction tend to feel a lot of shame. And sometimes they truly enjoy it. They can feel the physical pleasure. They can even enjoy the kind of physical connection with another person. An interesting thing about that is sometimes they can enjoy it at a time and then maybe afterwards struggle a little bit with it because that shame can creep in. Like, what's wrong with me? How can I want that? How can I enjoy that? So really, shame plays such a significant role here. But learning to be fully present and connected to your body and to the person that you're with from a place of ease and freedom is something that takes quite a bit of time. And there's a lot of doubt that can come up through the process of going back to the shoulds and shouldn'ts. There isn't a should or shouldn't in terms of what you want, what you like, or what you don't like. And part of healing is being able to honor what that is. So if you are, particularly like if you're in a committed relationship with somebody and it's a relatively healthy relationship, and maybe you've always gone along with something that you don't really want to do, and you come to that realization on this healing journey, it's not only okay, but it's important for you to be able to say to that person, you know, I don't want to do that. That is a really healthy thing to do. And if you are in a committed relationship, I can feel pretty confident in saying that if that's something you don't want to do, your partner isn't really going to want to do it either. Truly, if it's a healthy relationship, your partner isn't going to want to do something with you that you don't want to do. Just as you wouldn't want your partner to do something with you just because you want to do it and they really don't, right? So, assuming it's a healthy relationship, I think it's important to give that person kind of the benefit of doubt in that way as well. And if you're not in a committed relationship, and maybe you are just kind of dating here and there or whatever, or even if it's just one night stands here or there, being able to, it can be a little bit harder in this way because there's a lot that can go into how safe you really feel, whether you end up feeling shame afterward or not. Not that you should, but I know that that is a factor that plays in for a lot of people. It can be more challenging because there's just a lot more kind of unknown. Like you just don't feel as, well, safe emotionally, physically, kind of even like habits, right? So it can be more challenging in that regard, but it's not impossible. Part of that is being able to really connect with it and have more of a sense of what you want and need. So really, there is a whole lot more on this topic, but I wanted to hopefully just kind of maybe first start the conversation, particularly if you've had shame around it and really haven't felt like you could talk about it with somebody. Just take this as your sign that this is a healthy, important conversation to have, first with yourself, and then with others, and whether it's friends, because friends often don't talk about this stuff either, but we tend to struggle with a lot of the same things. And certainly a partner or potential partner down the road. They're all important things to talk about, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Truly, nothing to be ashamed of. Please take that in. No matter what it is, no matter where your mind just went and said, well, but what about this? Or what if that? No, doesn't matter. There's nothing that you experience. There is nothing that you want or desire or need when it comes to a healthy sexual relationship that is anything for you to be ashamed of. Take that in. Take a breath. Take it in. And exhale. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share what came up for you. Did anything surprise you? How was it to kind of sit here? What did you notice happening in your body through this conversation? It can be a really uncomfortable conversation to have. There was absolutely a time in which I never would have been able to do what I just did, to have this conversation here, to speak about it in the way that I did. And that's what happens with healing, because with healing, you release the shame. And shame is the biggest reason that we struggle with these kinds of conversations. Well, with lots of conversations probably, but especially these types of conversations. So let's connect in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the bell for notifications. And if you found this helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it. And if there's somebody in your life that you think really could benefit from hearing what I've shared today, maybe even consider sharing it with them. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.